Hello, I'm Tom Cadwallender, and I'm an old-fashioned bird watcher who's been around for a wee while, and I've lived at Alnmouth for quite a number of years, but we'll get into that in some detail when we get into this talk. Some of you may well know me, but for those who don't, I've been BTO regional rep. BTO is the British Trust for Ornithology, regional rep for Northumberland for the last kind of 30 years. And I've been bird watching, this is probably my 5th decade of bird watching. So I've been around a wee while, but you know, this patch bird watching is quite interesting. And I use the term patch as loosely as you can. And my kind of definition of a patch is where I can walk from home and get home again without, in about 3 hours and enough time to get me back for coffee. That's kind of my definition. And hopefully during the course of this presentation, you'll kind of see, you'll get a glimpse of my patch. And it is quite tricky to try and illustrate sort of all the different facets across all the different sort of seasons and trying to sort of pick out different things. So what I've thought about as a kind of a route through, I'm going to have a kind of a chronological sort of journey, looking at the seasons and starting with winter and going through the various habitats of the birds I'm going to be seeing during the course of that winter. And so that's kind of how it's going to work. So please bear with me on that. And also, this is the world premiere. Hey, if that's not too grand a thing. It's the world premiere of Birds of Alnmouth. I've never given this presentation to anyone else ever before in my life. And I've only just finished putting it together this morning. So there's some photographs actually I took yesterday, which I put in this morning. So hot off the press, some of the old photographs, some of the new photographs, and hot off the press. And just to say something about the photographs, the vast majority of the photographs are taken on site and by me. There are a couple of photographs which haven't been taken by me, and you'll see those as they come up. But anyway, that's the way it is. So it's Birds of Alnmouth. And without any further ado, let's get underway and see what we can see. But you know, what an opening slide! This sort of scene greets me on most sunny mornings. I'm down on the beach and it's absolutely fantastic. You can see Coot Island in the distance there. But anyway, let's not steal some of the stuff from the presentation. Let's get onto the detail. Looking back in the records, the earliest record of an interesting species at Alnmouth, in fact, the only species that of kind of real note I found in the records is a Glossy Ibis. Back in August of 1908, 5 Glossy Ibis turned up on the golf course at Alnmouth. 4 of them were stoned by local children and 1 of them flew off. And by the way, I wasn't one of the local children at that stage. I know 1 or 2 people might be thinking I'm old enough to do that, but I'm not really. But anyway, these birds were seen on the shore and on the golf course. And that kind of interesting record sort of goes back. And here's the golf course, a fabulous location. But actually, the golf course has played quite a big feature in my life, actually. But just less than a century later, another rare bird turns up, found by Alan Tilmouth, And this is a Citrine Wagtail found on the golf course. So the golf course is kind of crucial, if you like. But actually, going back to the beginning for me and how we kind of found this Alnmouth and what sort of turned us onto it. When we were looking to buy our house nearby, we were walking down on the shore just before we kind of finalized the details, and we found a wimbrel on the golf course. And we thought, this is the place for us. This has got to be pretty important. Also, after we moved in, we actually found a Blacktail Godwit. And this was back in 1989, when Blacktail Godwits were quite rare or unusual anyway. And we thought, gosh, this is the place. We've really landed on our feet, completely landed on our feet. But actually, it took another 20 years before we saw another Blacktail Godwit on the estuary. But now they're fairly regularly found. But actually, it's amazing to think that it took us that length of time to find another one. But it just shows how populations of some bird species have changed over time. And we were just sort of witnessing that first sort of that vanguard, if you like, of birds coming into the UK. But anyway, going back a little bit further, I just wanted to sort of to highlight some connection with the Natural History Society. And looking through the records, I came upon this chap, Harry Tully, who was quite instrumental in reinvigorating the ornithological section of the Natural History Society back following the Second World War. And Harry's family was quite an influential and successful shipping family on the River Tyne. And eventually he wound up the business interests, and he moved to Alnmouth full time, and he lived in a house called Wellfield. And I pass by Wellfield every single day, and I kind of imagine Harry being there. So Harry lived there for during the kind of the years following the Second World War, and he was quite instrumental. He reinvigorated a lot of the ornithological interest in the society. Actually, shortly after, perhaps in the late 50s, there was a group of young birders went off to form the Northumberland and Tyneside Bird Club, obviously at the behest or almost as an inspiration from Harry. But that's another story completely. But Harry, I feel incredibly privileged to walk in the same footsteps as Harry, and I kind of often think about him and his wanderings around the estuary of Alnmouth. During that sort of when I'm out there, I often think about him and think about what he saw and what his studies were. And his great interest was Dunlin. He was madly keen on Dunlin. And let's kind of remember back in those days, they weren't as sophisticated, if you like, generally about how they named birds. And generally speaking, that a lot of these small wading birds were known as sandpipers, and you may well have come across the term sandpipers at Alnmouth. But anyway, he was really interested in Dunlin, and we still get Dunlin on the estuary now, and that we're seeing them in small flocks. But it's interesting the contrast that I have with that I've got with Dunlin to what he had, and this is one of Harry's personally drawn graphs, which I dug out of the Natural History Society archive a number of years ago. I kind of stumbled upon this in a way, and when Harry died, all of his effects went to the British Trust for Ornithology, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm really quite sort of well ensconced with the BTO, and I contacted the BTO, and they said, oh well, actually we gifted the contents of Harry's archive to the Natural History Society, so they had it on permanent loan in the Hancock. And then it was kind of, it became a permanent feature. But anyway, I got the chance to go and look at the archive, and I found Harry's notes. And this is Harry's personal graph, personally drawn graph of his Dunlin records on the Aln estuary. And these cover the 4 years following the Second World War. Absolutely incredible. And I was so thrilled to see this, but there's an interesting contrast going on here. And you kind of look at the left-hand side of the graph. These are the kind of the numbers, and he was recording sort of numbers of up to 250, 260 in Januaries of the first sort of 2 or 3 years. That's absolutely incredible, because I have never, in the 30 years I've lived here, we moved here in 1989, I have never recorded 260 dunlins here ever, never mind in January. And the numbers, so that is a complete contrast to what Harry was finding. So what was that, 30 years later, it was different. But that's ornithology for you. That is how things change. And that got me to thinking, now, what difference has there been in other bird populations of during the intervening years between Harry and myself? And of course, one stark change is corn bunting. Corn bunting was once a common bird during the along the coastal strip, and when we first moved here in '89, they were still quite common. But however, I saw my last corn bunting in Alnmouth in 2001, and I've not seen another since. And they've gone completely back. But by contrast, we are seeing sort of changes. We now see little egrets on a regular basis, and the biggest group I've seen here is a group of 9. And until kind of March 2018, they were recorded in very, very big numbers, and I was hoping they would actually be kind of breeding here. But the bad weather of March 2018 sort of cleared them out. I'll go on a bit more about that later. That's a big change to Harry's day. Harry would have been thrilled. I'm still thrilled about seeing little egrets. I'm an old-time birder, and I still remember the days when little egrets were really incredibly rare. Another species which still gives me a thrill is the Avocet. Avocet is a recent colonizer to Northumberland, and whilst they don't breed on the Aln estuary, they breed on Druidge Bay. They postnatal dispersal means that we get regular sort of sightings of these birds on the Aln, and this has only started in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and that's another thrill, something Harry would have been immensely sort of taken with, without a doubt. But anyway, that's kind of just some of the changes that we've seen. And to move into the kind of the talk and sort of run through sort of modern Alnmouth, if you like, I'm going to work through in a chronological order, dealing with winter and then species which we find here. But in the winter time, for me, the whole area is about waterfowl, waders and ducks and geese and swans. But we'll start with the ducks. Flooded meadows, each winter is different. You know, this winter particularly is very, very wet, and we're seeing water lying everywhere. And this is perfect for species like widgeon. When we first moved here, widgeon wasn't a particularly common species during the winter time, but the numbers, and it's a small estuary as well, and the numbers that we see, I'm counting now sort of 600 to 700 of these birds towards the back of the winter. Some of them we share with the Coat estuary, but they're there, and they're slightly changing their attitudes as well. They're moving around. Beautiful birds, and these birds are coming down from Northern Europe to winter here. It's quite special, and they're now in mid-January in their prime, in their perfect plumage. They're wonderful. And it's not just the farmland that's flooded, the coastal marshes are too. The salt marshes is flooded on a regular basis at this point, and we're seeing other species of wildfowl. Teal, for example, the smallest of the ducks that we have coming to the UK, and we see them in quite big numbers, and they mix quite readily with widgeon. And I'm often seeing flocks of several hundred birds, and you can hear them whenever you walk around the place. You can hear them, the whistling calls they make, and it's quite evocative. You'll hear them at dusky, you hear them pre-dawn, and it's absolutely fabulous. These two species are kind of key to the character of the Aln estuary. They're absolutely amazing, beautiful birds. But in recent years, we've had build-ups of big numbers of species like Canada geese. Canadas are feral birds without any stretch of the imagination, but they've created quite an image for the local people. People love to hear them flying over in big numbers, and they're quite spectacular, even though they're quite sort of potential pests to a certain extent. And we have got good numbers of greylag geese. Greylags are, again, a large proportion of them are feral. And we do know that a number of them come down from Iceland, but you think, well, actually, that's kind of diluted over the time. And you think most of them are kind of are feral birds. However, there was several winters ago, I picked up this bird with the neck collar on, and I was quite intrigued by this whole thing. I thought it was one of the kind of the UK breeding birds, which was just has this little migration from the Lake District to kind of Yorkshire. Anyway, I got the number contacted the ringing office and discovered this bird had been ringed in Iceland the previous year, which kind of confirms that whilst there are a lot of feral birds around, there are still wild birds who are making this journey. They're still coming to the UK to winter, and some of them come to the Alnmouth to winter. And all these geese that are around are bringing in others. And one spectacular species, and it sort of gives me a kind of a feeling in my gut when I hear the first pinks, the pink feet coming through, the pink-footed goose coming through in their massive skeins. And they're so evocative as they fly through overnight. And I can hear them, I can lie in bed and hear them flying over. And there they are. But they're coming through in big numbers. They're flying down from Greenland and they're flying down from Iceland. A lot of them are wintering in our part of the world now. Originally, they were just flying through into to the Norfolk coast to winter. But we see them and hear them coming through in big, massive skeins. But occasionally they'll come down. And they're beautiful geese, these grey geese. They're absolutely fantastic. But these big numbers of geese are actually bringing in other species, rarer species. And these are our European or Russian white-fronted geese. And there was a gang of them, about 12 of them, spent a big chunk of last winter in one or two fields nearby, and they were quite approachable, and they were absolutely wonderful to see. But you don't see them in great numbers in the county really these days. And of course we have Brent geese that come through. This is a dark-bellied bird, and the birds on Lindisfarne, as we know, are light bellies when there's a growing population of dark bellies. But this dark-bellied bird spent a week or two on the Alnmouth during several winters ago, and caused quite a lot of interest. And I'm sure these birds are attracted by the other big numbers of geese that are hanging around the place as well. But the River Aln is tidal, and when the tide's high, it's quite a big sort of water resource. And we have whooper swans coming and spending a little bit of time washing and brushing up. They're spending a lot of time in fields nearby, grazing, and they do like the old seed rape, and they're grazing there, but they will flight in. And the honking noise that they make is another evocative sound that we hear during the autumn and in the winter time. Absolutely wonderful. And these birds will spend some time here too, flying back and forward to their time in their fields. But the river itself, it is a rich fish river, and we have good numbers of flounders. And it's obviously very close to the sea where we are, and red-breasted mergansers are coming in not big numbers, but we have several pairs, and they're coming in just now, and they're feeding on fish in the estuary. Absolutely wonderful to see. And of course, red-breasted mergansers are related to gooseanders and of course smew. And cormorants come in. We don't see shag actually in the estuary, but we do see cormorants. And again, they're feeding on flounders or flatties, as we used to call them as kids, coming into the estuary. Absolutely wonderful, almost as much as they can eat actually. But again, we've got other fish-eating duck here. We've got goldeneye coming in quite good numbers, particularly when the sea is a bit rough. They will come and spend some time on the estuary. And we're thinking about other birds. We've got little grebe. Now, little grebe is an interesting species, and they start arriving here sort of back of the summer, early autumn. And the peak counts I've had on the river, and it's only a section of about a mile and a half of the river. I've had kind of 21 of these little grebes fishing in small groups, and they often fish in amongst the cormorants. And I think to myself, careful, mate, you're going to end up as food for these cormorants, because I'm sure a cormorant could swallow a little grebe quite easily without a problem. But I've not seen that happen just yet. But as the tide falls on the river, muddy margins are shown. Obviously not straight ahead because it's a reinforced embankment, but you can see on the left-hand side muddy sections, and this is all the case right through to the estuary mouth. And we get big numbers of curlews. Curlews are spending a lot of their time here, and they appear in the autumn, and they're here right through the winter. Counts of up to 300 birds during times of low tide. A lot of these birds will disperse across the fields, and we see, particularly when the fields are soft like now, but we're seeing them in quite good numbers. The birds that we see here, obviously we know that the curlew is going through quite a torrid time in terms of its breeding population. We see the breeding birds call in on the way out in the autumn, But the birds we have wintering here are birds are from Northern Europe, from Finland and Scandinavia and so forth. So they're coming through. So we're seeing quite good numbers of these guys, and they're feeding in the salt marsh. And we do know that the longer-billed birds tend to be females, and the shorter-billed birds tend to be males, although it's quite difficult at times to sort them out. But the other big number of birds that we see are the red shank, and red shank are, again, there's 100 to 200 of these birds which will be regularly found throughout the estuary, and they're quite an important feature. And the estuary is a special site of special scientific interest, designated because of the wildfowl and particularly the waders. And other long-billed birds we see sort of feeding on the estuary. We have now small numbers of bar-tailed godwit coming to feed on the estuary, and they're adding an extra sort of layer of interest that we have here. But as the river goes out onto the shore, onto the coast, we see quite an open coast, and typical of a lot of the Northumberland coast, the Alnmouth Bay is kind of enclosed by rocky promontories. The sand is held in place by these rocky promontories. You can see this sort of situation right up and down this coastline. And in the north of what I call my patch here is at Seaton Point, and there's a nice bit of rocks there, and that's full of waders at times. You can see the sandy shore here. Midway down the bay, we have Marden Rocks, which is directly opposite Foxton at the north end of Alnmouth Golf Course. And at the south end, we've got Burling Cars, or sometimes called Killiecrankie Cars by the fishermen. And of course, that leads across onto Coot Island. And these three rocky promontories are so important for a number of bird species. And I'll touch on one or two of them just now. The first one is the purple sandpiper. Purple sandpiper is a species which the Northumberland coast is designated as a special protection area for. These birds come down from Svalbard in the north to winter on the Northumberland coast and elsewhere, of course, but the Northumberland coast has a really good population of them. And the majority of the wintering population is held in the kind of the north of the county, but there's the sort of outposts further south. Here on Burling Cars, we'll probably find something like 20 birds. If you get out to Coot, I was out there just before the turn of the year, and I counted just under 140 out there. So this area is really quite important for these species, but we are seeing a change. We're seeing purple sandpipers short stopping. They're making the journey from Svalbard, their breeding areas, and they're not making the full journey all the way to the UK to winter. They're stopping on the way. They're stopping in northern Europe, in Scandinavia, Norway, and around the rocky coasts there. And they're not moving until they have to, until the weather actually forces them off. And we've noticed through our studies that actually that's happening now later and later, that the numbers of birds are not arriving until the back end of the year. And this phenomenon is a direct result of climate change, and it's known as short stopping. But it's amazing how it's actually, you can quantify the whole thing. But purple sandpipers are just one of my favorite species. Wading birds are kind of really one of the big things for me, and purple sandpipers just really do it. And the other species that the Northumberland coast is designated for is turnstone. Turnstone, of course, you see on the sandy shore here, they're really quite omnivorous, if you like. They love the rocky shore, but they will be found on the sandy shore, and they love to be sort of fertling in amongst seaweed. And this is a bird in summer plumage here. What a difference to the wintering bird. And we should see some of these birds coming through at the back of the winter. If not, the early birds returning, we'll see them in this sort of plumage, but they're here for the winter. Some of these birds are using as a service station on their onward migration. They're heading further south. Other birds are going to be here for the whole winter, and it's fascinating, that whole process. And I was involved in quite detailed studies of turnstones several winters ago, where we fitted radio transmitters to the backs of these turnstones. We caught some on Druidge Bay, and I was going twice every 2 days with my my satellite sort of receiver, my radio receiver, and trying to check where these birds were. What we're really interested in is trying to find out how big their home range was in their winter quarters. And we've discovered that within 2 to 3 kilometers, that's all they traveled whilst they were here for the winter. And during the hours of darkness and high tides, these birds dispersed and they were on the offshore islands. Lots of the birds that I was tracking ended up on Crooked Island. I got a chance to go out there and I tracked them out to that point. Amazing. Little peeling back the layers of this wintering biology of this species. Fascinating, actually. And this area is really quite important for this species. But it's not just the wading birds that we see on the rocky shore. At the top of the beach, there's lots of kobolds and other sorts of rocks, boulders and so forth. And this is a wonderful safe haven for a species like rock pipit. We know it's rock pipit because it's kind of a greeny sort of back and it's got dark legs, contrasting with the meadow pipit. And these are kind of wintering here. I don't see many during the breeding season, but we see much more in the wintering, the winter season. And a number of the birds are showing characteristics of the Scandinavian race, the Littoralis race, but also we get one or two water pipits as well in amongst them all. And we see the differences when it comes to the spring, when they start to change into their summer plumage and become much more pinky. So it's another quite an interesting feature of Alnmouth Bay, the top end of the bay. But moving on to the kind of the sandy shore and the sandy shore specialists, we've got a kind of an interesting range of species. And this is a photograph I took 2 nights ago, and it just shows how birds are using the sandy shore at dusk time. And one of the species is grey plover. Grey plover away from Lindisfarne is quite an uncommon bird. And but at Alnmouth, there's quite a good roost of them, and I've counted sort of 50 to 60 birds there. There's quite a great number compared to kind of away from Lindisfarne. Wonderful birds, grey plovers. And you see them in summer plumage, just as a bird just coming out of summer plumage. Oh, they're just quite something, quite special. And of course, oyster catchers are around the place all the time. And this photograph, I wanted to include this photograph just to illustrate the issues that we have because of big numbers of birds using the shore for either roosting or feeding. They are really incredibly vulnerable, particularly in the winter time, because this is a critical time for them. And if they get disturbed, they can't feed. And if they can't feed, they become malnourished. So they become sort of peril, basically. So really, we should be very, very concerned about our wading bird populations. And there's more and more people using the shore now. So we have to be very, very careful. But again, on the shore, back to the shore, we can see these waders using it. This is a gang of sanderling. Sanderling are at the north end of the bay, Alnmouth Bay, just close to Seaton Point, and they're there in quite big numbers. And you'll recognise these birds. These are the real white ones, and they're kind of following the breaking of the water. They're feeding on microscopic invertebrates, just feeding along that edge. The sand is just turned by the sea, and there's these invertebrates are just sort of released, and these birds are feeding on them quite voraciously. And they're wonderful birds. But there's quite a contrast. The white birds are quite a contrast to the birds we see in summer plumage. They're quite interesting. And we, again, at the end of the season and the beginning of the season, we do see them in the sort of plumage. Other species are kind of ringed plovers. We see them in quite good numbers coming through in certain ways. And again, ringed plovers is a bird that comes through and using it as using the Northumberland coast as a service station. But the sea is important. This little bit of sheltered bay of the North Sea is incredibly important for certain species. We don't see a lot of passage through here, but we do see good numbers of divers. And this is a red-throated diver feeding on small fish off the rocky promontories. And they're quite good numbers. We also see black-throated diver and great northern diver. I've seen both of those species this winter. Both of those species are really quite uncommon, whereas the red-throated diver is 15 to 20 quite readily. And also, great crested grebes. Unusually for this part of the world, we see great crested grebes on the sea during the winter time. This last 2 days, I picked up a Slavonian grebe offshore as well. But currently, there are big numbers of guillemots and razorbills. Razorbills are a little bit early, but guillemots are never far offshore. They don't go too far, and they'll come in quite close. But they've got to be careful. If the weather cuts are bad, they can end up to be victim of these large gulls. Now, this is quite a crucial thing because this is a razorbill and it's just not fit enough to be able to feed, and they become victim. And this juvenile greater black-backed gull is just taking this bird out completely. But other times, this is an archive picture, and it's one of the pictures I didn't take, obviously, of a big storm quite early in the season. And these birds, the guillemots, had come inshore, and they were dropped onto the beach, and I was rescuing them. This was probably in the mid-90s, this picture. And most of these birds would have perished because they don't travel too well. I was picking up one or two puffins at the same time, and they all perished simply because you can't really do very much for them, and they're so stressed they will just die, which is incredibly sad. So yes, so this time of year we're seeing the kind of, even now we're seeing the change. Getting into the other part of the kind of the estuary, there's a big sandy bank on the southern shore of the River Aln at the mouth, and this will feature again and later in the talk. We're seeing big numbers of gulls. These are small gulls, black-headed gulls in big numbers, but also we're seeing lots of common gulls. At the minute, there's something like sort of 500 to 600 black-headed gulls and 700 or 800 common gulls just spending some time on the shore, waiting to be displaced, and they'll go across the Coquet to spend the rest of their evening. In the morning, I see them flying over home on their way back out to the fields. And interestingly, further south along the coast at Newbiggin, we're seeing big numbers of Mediterranean gulls. But I see so few Mediterranean gulls at Alnmouth, even though they breed on Coquet Island. I see so few of these birds. It's fascinating how that contrast has come around. But winter is quite a tough old time. And this last few days, we've seen quite a lot of bad weather inland. It's been very, very wet here on the shore, on the coast, but we can see it like this. And we see all sorts of cold weather movements. Coot is a species which is a very, very familiar species, but it isn't here at Alnmouth. And it's a cold weather movement. And you'll see this one has got a ring on it. And it was quite interesting. There's a little gang of Coot turned up a number of winters ago. And as I was just working through them, I saw this bird had a ring on it. And I managed to get a photograph. And I got in touch with my good friend, Andy Rickard, who spends a lot of time catching Coots. And it was one of his birds from Killingworth Lake. And it made this arduous, long migration from Killingworth to Alnmouth. But it was quite unusual that it did that. And this was as a result of cold weather. Fascinating record. But I've not seen Coot at Alnmouth in the last 5 years. That shows you how rare they are. And I'm out almost every day. But anyway, fascinating record. And you never know what you might see. And of course, what's common in one place may not be common in another place. But yes, this weather can be pretty appalling. And this was during the March 2018, when the so-called beast from the east came through, and we're seeing all sorts of species feeding right on the shoreline. This is a fieldfare, and the received wisdom is that these birds had come in from inland to the coast, which, and you think it's quite odd when you reckon that the wind was coming from the east, so the birds would have to travel into the wind. That was a difficult one for me. Whilst I know that fieldfares will still winter in quite good numbers in Helsinki and southern Finland, and I just wondered whether they had been pushed out by the beast from the east to make a belated migration to cross the North Sea. But we're seeing big numbers of fieldfares. We're seeing big numbers of redwings, and really, normally we don't see these birds except on their passage through here. They might drop in just sort of briefly on their way through, but normally you just hear them either weeping as they cross over in the darkness. That's the redwings, or the fieldfares will chack as they head north, as they head inland overhead, and they'll drop into fields just up the way. But that's the only time we generally see them, unless the weather cuts in bad. But on a normal winter, we like to get out to the dunes, and there's birds to be found in the dunes, wintering there. And species like twite are a beautiful little finch, and you can see the yellow bill on this bird, and they'll winter in decent numbers. 10 to 15 to 20, perhaps even up to 50 of these birds will winter on buston links right down through into Warkworth. And these birds are here for the winter time, and they're quite closely related to linnets and redpolls, and I thought that sort of thing, and they kind of look very, very similar. But again, on the buston links, there is a kind of a structure which attracts species like black redstart, and black redstart winters in this part of the world, although not here this winter. There's birds wintering at Newbiggin, at Tynemouth, and at sea houses. but we have had occasionally black redstarts wintering on the old guano shed, which is on the Buston Links. The guano shed is kind of, it was thought to be a storage. It was when Alnmouth was a busy seaport, and it was thought that guano was brought from South America. Guano is bird droppings from some of these big, massive seabird colonies in South America, brought here as fertilizer in exchange for slates or grain or whatever going out of Alnmouth. It's become dilapidated, but it's become a structure which is of interest to black redstarts. But the salt marsh in itself is fascinating, and it's a source of great interest, because a lot of birds will move through here, and they'll use as a point of migration and a point of wintering. Snow buntlings will winter here, only in small numbers. This winter so far, before the turn of the year, I had 9 or 10 birds sort of in between the shore and the salt marsh. But 2 winters ago, we had 4 shorelarks wintered right through, and it was great from November right through to March. And we saw them change from their kind of their autumn plumage right through into their breeding plumage, which was quite something. And so every 3 or 4 years, I get 1 or 2 shorelarks on the salt marsh on Buston Links. But further south on Buston Links, I'm seeing good numbers of yellowhammers and reed buntlings and linnets, and the farmers are very, very sympathetic, and they'll leave in place crops which are kind of beneficial to these species, which are containing seeds, for example. But it's not just the wild habitat. Sometimes the gardens turn up some interesting sort of things. This is my front garden, quite close to Alnmouth, and I like to sort of feed birds, and you're never sure what's going to pop in. We get regular sort of feeding flocks of coming through here. I've a range of species, but you know, waxwings will come through and on a regular basis. It's not a waxwing winter, but when it is a waxwing winter, I see them coming through the garden, and they'll sort of perch there. And this kind of the crest they have is like a great ponytail as they catches the breezes. But we see them on a regular basis. And of course, tree sparrow is a regular in our garden, and there's a number of colonies around of tree sparrows, and we see them, and they're very common species, as indeed as house sparrow. I know a lot of the urban house sparrows population is in decline, but actually in this part of the world it's holding up pretty well. But we see bullfinches now. There's an interesting gathering of bullfinches in the area, adds a superlative colour to the whole proceedings. And during migration time, of course, blackbirds are coming in, but we are seeing birds which show significant continental traces with the black bills using our gardens quite significantly. And most winters I have about 20 blackbirds who will use the garden. I do feed the birds, but about 20 birds will come and use the garden on a regular basis. And in the patch, there's only been ever 2 records of ringneck parakeet. One was a bird flying over, not far from where I live, and the second record was actually in my garden. And Muriel sort of called me one morning and said, Tom, we've got a garden tick, And I rushed down, and there was this ringneck parakeet sitting on the feeder, and I managed to get some pictures of it. Here was me standing in my underwear. Perhaps you didn't want to know that, but this is me standing in my underwear in the porch with my camera, taking pictures of this ringneck parakeet. And off it lasted about 15 minutes, and off it went, never to be seen again. And there are our 2 records of ringneck parakeet. I know they're pests, but they are colourful, and they're quite exotic, and they catch one's imagination, and this one did. And I think it's great. My opinion may change if the population changes dramatically, but anyway, quite exciting all the same. But anyway, winter generally gives way to spring, and we see the first of kind of the fulmars knocking around. In fact, we're seeing fulmars now, sort of just hawking around, surfing the area. And of course, with spring comes summer, and where we see the influence of Coot Island. I have a rare privilege that I get a chance to go across to Coot on a regular basis. I work on roseate terns across there, and this is about to start my 30th season working on roseate terns. But we see the influence of Coot Island on our bit of the estuary. This is the southern shore, but the first of the terns come in, and when kind of in March time, I can hear the sandwich terns in the river. We saw red-breasted mergansers and cormorants fishing the river. Sandwich terns will do exactly the same. They will come and fish the river, and it's a great sight to see your first sandwich terns coming into the river and just following the track as they all make their way up. And they'll not go too far up, but they'll kind of just hold back and forward. It's absolutely wonderful. But we also see common terns coming from Coot and fishing in the river as well. And again, it's another great feature of the area. And Arctic terns and the rare roseate terns will gather on the south bank of the river, as I mentioned earlier, where those gulls were. On the south shore of the estuary, there's this great sandbank. And these birds will gather, these terns will gather, more particularly at the back of the summer where there are a lot of young birds there. But I get my first sightings of roseate terns and common terns and Arctic terns on that sandy bank. When they're there, they've made their arrival from Africa and they're there. And it's just absolutely amazing. And it's a really good roost. If you're in this part of the world, just check out that southern hangout. It's fabulous. It really is very, very good. But there it is. It's the sandy bank where these birds are hanging out. And the sea, of course, is so important to all these breeding birds, all these breeding seabirds. And one species that we do see quite regularly, it's the gannet. Of course, gannet doesn't breed here. The nearest breeding point is the mighty Bass Rock. And the breed, in fact, isn't the Bass Rock so the largest breeding colony of gannets in Europe? I can't remember the detail of that, but they're there. But they will pass through on regular basis. And just occasionally, there will be big hatches of small fish. And I've seen scores and scores and scores of gannets plunge diving so close to the shore. I've been within kind of spitting distance of these birds, and they're diving and actually completely oblivious to me sort of standing nearby watching them. But it's a great feature of the summer. But of course, on the farmland, we see some interesting things. It can be pretty boring, fairly mundane farmland in the area, but it's big, wide open spaces, and it's quite picturesque at times. And some of the farmers are making an effort to kind of create a bit of botanical interest in their seed mixes. And there's a great range of species here. There's poppies, of course, and there's crimson clover, which in this crop, which I hadn't come across before. This is just this last year. But we do support good numbers of yellowhammers and green finches, but they disappear just ever so slightly during the winter time. I saw my first ones just the other day, but they are here. Reed buntings in good numbers. They'll feed along the hedgerows. And of course, we have got good numbers of common buzzards compared to, say, 30 years ago, where they just didn't happen. This is another change that Harry Tully would have noticed very, very clearly, that there's a change in attitudes towards birds of prey generally here, although we do see some differences. And of course, grey partridge. Around the place, there are lots of blue bins which have been put out by the local estate, the Northumberland estates, by their keepers to help support populations of grey partridge, and they are very, very good. We do see red-legged partridge here, and there is a lot of competition between the two species, but we do see benefits for the small bird population like yellowhammers and reed buntings and greenfinches and so forth. They are benefiting from the seed that's put out for the game birds such as grey partridge, and of course some of them are shot. We do see lots of pheasants as well. And the hedgerows can be full of birds, which is fabulous. And as we're wandering around the place, I'm sort of finding the first sort of chiff-chaffs. They're great to hear coming in. Willow warblers are just everywhere. It's fabulous. And of course, kestrels are feeding along on the because they're attracted. They feed on the small voles and insects, and a lot of the voles are attracted to the seed that's dropped by the seed bins. But again, in terms of the cover, there's one or two little pockets of colour. This runs across the Bracken Hill, just really leading on to Alnmouth. And this is a great source of small bird populations. And whitethroats are here. Summer visitors like whitethroats are breeding there readily. Lesser whitethroats, and interestingly, they come in quite a distinct band of time coming in. And blackcaps, of course, are abundant right across that whole area. And we do have resident birds breeding here. Song thrushes are kind of recovering in this part of the world, and they're doing quite well, thank you very much. But further across farmland, the estuary land, the short grassland is quite useful from the point of view of exposing voles, and we have a good number of barn owls in the area. benefiting from the great number of barn owl boxes that have been put up in the whole area. I can, at one point, I can stand and look around the whole area and see 8 different barn owl sites, barn owl boxes. And so the population is fairly robust, and they will last except when the bad weather cuts in, or prolonged periods of bad weather. Of course, we've got little patches of reeds in the area, not great reeds like you've got at Gosford Park, but you know, they're there all the same, and they do provide populated habitat for grasshopper warbler, which is in quite good numbers, and it is sedge warbler. And 2 years ago, I found my first reed warbler breeding in the area, which is fabulous. And the small reeds are not big enough to support marsh harriers, but we do see them coming through on a regular basis, quartering and so forth. They do come through here. Woodland is in a premium. We do have small patches of woodland. This is at Alwood, just running down to into Alnmouth. Lovers Walk, the fenced line there is a nice walk along the river there. It's high tide. But this conifer plantation is deceptive because it is home to about 8 pairs of grey herons. And coming in February, we'll hear the first of the kind of the nest fettling going on there. The adults will get in there. Then during the course of the summer, I'll hear the various clacking of the young birds, and the young bird, the clacking changes and noise gets deeper as the young birds get bigger. But there's a lot of noisy bedfellows in there. We've got rook. It's a huge rookery as well, and they're crying everywhere in there. It's wonderful. It's just a great sort of cacophony of noise. And even the smallest of birds are in there amongst them as well. We do hear the squeaks of goldcrest amongst them. But water, standing water, is at a premium in this part of the world. We get transient water, yes, but standing water is at a premium. So back in 2008, when I was working for the Northumberland coast area about standing natural beauty, I was involved with the Environment Agency on a bit of habitat creation. And what we did do was we took down flood embankments to allow the natural processes and recreate scrapes. So we did that right up the estuary. So we allowed the tidal waters to kind of breach and actually flood across the farmland and recreate salt marsh and recreate habitats for birds and indeed for flowers. It was quite an interesting project. At first, the local people were saying, oh, what about our house going to flood and so forth. But we kind of explained to them what was happening, and people could understand and saw the benefits to wildlife and the landscape. It was just immense because we took down all these old flood banks and we allowed the river, the tide, nature to kind of take its kind of course. And what we end up now is a fabulous kind of diversity of wet habitats. We still haven't got any permanent stands of water, but we've got lots of transient pools, and we see the change in the kind of the flooded areas, and it's made quite a difference to kind of the bird population, and obviously common species like moorhen breeds in abundance now, and we've improved the habitat for species like lapwing. Last year I had the opportunity through lockdown to study a particular area in quite a lot of detail, and I counted something like 10 to 12 pairs of lapwings in this one particular area, which is quite something. And a lot of them were quite successful. And in that same area, we had snipe. I thought snipe was a migrant bird through this area that came and stopped in and moved off. But actually, they breed in the area. And during the summer, it was absolutely wonderful to walk down either dawn or dusk and hear the drumming of snipe, which I just hadn't heard before. I spent a lot of my summers away doing various work. I work as a freelance ornithologist and tour guide and broadcaster, so I spend a lot of time away in the summer. But to find them actually breeding here was quite something special. Oh, what a thrill. And of course, red shanks, a species which is actually under pressure on a lot of farmland sites, did quite well here. There's 2 or 3 pairs actually got young off. But the whole part of this, the estuary is fed by the River Aln. River Aln is quite a small river. It surfaces, if you like, at Alnmouth, which is west of Alnwick, and the river is only about sort of what 20 miles, 28 kilometers long, but it's a beautiful river, and the Aln name relates to sort of early English, and it's kind of thought to be something bright, shines brightly, or crystal clear, or something like that in that sort of area. But in the winter time, it's absolutely wonderful, incredibly atmospheric. But in the summer, in the breeding season, it just becomes just a fabulous sort of place, and it provides us with a range of species. And several years ago, there was a bizarre record of a black-crowned night heron here. I didn't see that bird, by the way, but I was away doing other things, but Muriel got to see it more, and she keeps reminding me of that as well. But it does provide a great habitat for species like dipper, and there's 2 or 3 pairs of dippers in the kind of the patch area. And we also see quite good numbers of grey wagtail, and there's kingfishers in the area as well as gousanders breeding upriver. But the river comes through into the estuary, and estuarine mud is just so rich, not just from the invertebrate point of view, but it actually is just a valuable tool. And house martins come down and they'll gather mud there to build their nests, and indeed will swallows. And we see them in big numbers coming onto the estuary to gather mud to go off and to build their nests. And this is another sign of a wonderful sign of summer. But when the tide's up, the river itself becomes really incredibly picturesque, and the sea duck come in. We have a good population of eiders in this whole area, although the breeding population is under some pressure. They breed on Coot, but the numbers are going down. And to prove they breed on mainland is quite tricky, because they do bring their young across very, very early. But we do get the benefit of seeing the display of the eider and their woo, woo sort of noise, starting sort of February time. We'll hear them, and they're just wonderful. The county bird of Northumberland, who could not fall in love with an eider, for goodness sake? Absolutely brilliant. But to prove their nesting is incredibly tricky. And I found 1 or 2 pairs upriver, but sometimes they're just so stupid. They will breed and they'll build nests in the craziest of places. You can see on the slide, it's by a roadside. You can see the 20-mile-an-hour limit. I don't know if you can pick the nest out, but it's just here. And it's tucked underneath the hedge. This bird laid 2 eggs, and it's next to a cycle track, in between a cycle track and the road. It failed, fair enough, but actually it just shows. This is one of the few documented eider breeding attempts on mainland, and it's amazing. Actually, it's fantastic that they've tried it, but it's so difficult. The species is so difficult to quantify, because, as I mentioned, they'll bring their young across, and their favourite place is the Coot estuary, and they pile in there. But occasionally they will come into the Aln estuary. But I'm never sure whether they're bred in the Aln or they've been brought across by their parents and their aunties, and that's another story completely. But it's wonderful to see them, and I see sort of several broods in the Aln. But to see them feed here as well, this river is really quite rich, and to watch a female eider dismember a crab, it is something else. Absolutely incredible. This bird I watched for about half an hour, and it was throwing this crab up, catching it, and snipping its legs off one by one, throwing it up, catching it, nipping a leg off, throwing it up, and it ended up with the carapace at all. And you know how the shaped bill of an eider is this kind of wedge shape, this triangle shape, and they can exert an immense amount of pressure on that tip. And all it does, it breaks open the carapace and swallows this carapace whole. Absolutely, what a kind of marvel. I was so thrilled to watch that whole process take place. It was something else. But that was quite special, quite privileged. But as I mentioned, the river holds populations of goosander, and there's 2 or 3 pairs of goosander will breed right up towards Alnmouth, and Alnmouth is about 5 miles inland. Generally speaking, I don't wander that far up, but I'll go to perhaps a couple to 3 miles inland, and I see these birds, and they'll bring their young right down to the river, right down to the river mouth, and they'll get quite big as well. To see them like this, it's just fantastic. But the duneland is quite special too, and both on the leading edge, like this, where it has become eroded, and we ended up with a clear face, although it's quite friable and quite sort of precarious. We still have quite good population of sand martins, and this is a sand martin colony at the north end of the bay near Foxton, just south of Seaton Point. And this is quite successful, and there was quite a lot of birds here this summer gone, and they will hang in the roots there, just sort of chill in the sun before they kind of think they'll have to set off. But this is a good sign in itself. But the duneland will hold numbers of skylarks and meadow pipits, and they are really quite a big feature. But the duneland is rich. It's designated a site of special scientific interest because of the floral composition, and this is only a hint of that. But also we have a good number of stone chats. Of course, stone chats breed along the coastal strip, and now they get inland. But if the weather cuts in bad for the winter, they will be nipped, if you like, inland, and they'll kind of retreat back to their coastal heartland. But we do see on buster lynx, I've counted sort of 5 to 6 pairs breeding along there, and they will have 2 to 3 broods at times as well. So they are really quite a colourful feature of this whole area. But the estuary is just a magical place. And as we sort of transition into autumn, we kind of see the passage waders starting to come through. And first of all is the green shank. And the call of the, you don't actually see them very often. You hear the call first, and you hear the call. It's happening. And these will start to come sort of back of July. Can you imagine autumn in July? That's when it's happening for waders, of course. Sometimes it's a little bit earlier. But yeah, we get good numbers of green shank. And there's 2 kind of waves. And we're seeing sort of Scottish birds coming through, and also seeing Scandinavian birds coming through. Common sandpipers will come through in quite good numbers. I'll see a dozen of these quite easily. I'll see wood sandpiper and green sandpiper as well. But these birds, these common sandpipers, are Scandinavian because, again, I was involved in a study 25 years ago on common sandpiper, and we proved that Northumbrian breeding common sandpipers, actually on their southern migration, they headed straight south. They will go straight down the country, hit the south coast and out into the Iberian Peninsula, and off they go. Whereas the ones we find on the east coast here are of Scandinavian origin, which is quite interesting. So these birds are on their way. They're staging, if you like, on the Alnmouth estuary. But yes, back to the Foxton Bend. A great horseshoe in the River Aln. It is just spectacular, particularly when the floods are running. When on the spring tide, which we are coming this weekend, the water there, and you can see the result of some of the kind of the habitat creation that I was involved with in 2008. This is heartening because I was involved doing this, and I'm now seeing I'm reaping the rewards, the fruits of my labour, if you like. And my leg was always pulled about Tom creating his personal nature reserve. It's fantastic. It's really wonderful, and those birds will move through here quite readily. But as we see the odd rare one, this is marsh sandpiper. Back in the eclipse year of 1999, Muriel was out just in the gloaming. I was at work, and she found 2 marsh sandpipers. This photograph was by Steve Race, taken in Sri Lanka. This is the second of the photographs that I didn't take. But I just had to show this. This was a bird found by Muriel, or she found 2 of them, and it just shows the potential of this place. And not so many years ago, a lot of birders in Northumberland got their county tick at that very spot, Foxton Bend. They got the spotted sandpiper. There was one in partial summer plumage, or even in full summer plumage, in that area, found by a couple of guys who were just popping through. It's interesting. I rarely find rare birds here, but they found it there. And this bird, this spotted sandpiper, provided a great spectacle for all and sundry. I couldn't actually see the bird from my house, but I could see the bird watchers from my house, which was quite interesting. Anyway, so we do attract quite good numbers. But at the high tide roost, in the September high tide roost, it is something else. The spring tides of the high tide in September is just incredible, absolutely incredible. I mentioned earlier about we're having to wait 20 years for Blacktail Godwits to come in any number, but they do come in big numbers now, and we can sort of 30s to 40s to 50s of them, which is something else. But these are mixed with curlews, they're mixed with red shanks, they're mixed with knot. And when you see a summer plumage knot, you'll understand why they're called red knot, because they're red and they're just the back end of their summer plumage sort of transition, and they're fabulous. And there's lapwings coming through. So there's hundreds of birds will use the high tide roost. And this roost is easily visible from either the cycle track that runs from the cricket ground, or even just the road that runs down at the Alnmouth. They're all there, and it's dead easy birding. It's brilliant. So yes, autumn is just absolutely fantastic. But yes, the estuary itself, whenever you're out, you're just in a wonderful landscape, a wonderful estuarine seascape. It's just fantastic. But you never know what's going to happen. And there's all sorts of things turn up. And when it comes to the autumn, I got a call last autumn to say, there's this bird of prey, we think it's a peregrine. It's on the road and it's not going to fly away. And I don't know what to do. So I knew what was happening. I thought I knew what was happening. This bird had got some prey, and I didn't want to go. That's what it was. So I went up, and it was just at the north end, just by Seaton Point. And sure enough, it was a peregrine in a road with his feet on his prey. And when I approached, it sort of dropped off into the hedge. And I was within 3 meters of this bird. And I could see the prey there quite clearly. And I knew exactly what it was. It was a kestrel. This peregrine had taken a kestrel. And I had just been watching a kestrel sort of in that area hovering just sort of the day beforehand. So it was obviously, and it was, of course, we have kestrels coming in to winter in this part of the world. So this peregrine had just sort of walloped a kestrel. But it just sat in the hedge, at the bottom of this hedge. And this photograph is taken with my phone. Believe it or not. Wonderful. Ah, what a thrill. What a thrill. But anyway, we see birds coming through on migration. We see wheat ears coming through and other small birds. We do get sort of occasional folds of species. We have obviously blackbirds coming through at times and fieldfares. We occasionally have species like ringoozle dropping in. In fact, one winter we had ringoozle overwintering on the estuary, which is quite fun. And I have found species like yellow-browed warbler, and they're becoming much more frequent now. And so you just never know what's going to happen, what can happen in this part of the world. It's great fun. It's absolutely fantastic fun. And if you bump onto one of these fellas, it just adds an extra bit of spice to the whole bit of your bird watching. This is long-eared owl, of course. Just winking, sort of, yeah. Hi, Tom. Yes. Hi, fella. Thanks for that. Anyway, but as I said, this is just a wonderful place to be. And whenever I'm out, when I'm at home, I'll walk out every single day. And whether it's on the south side or the north side or wherever it is, I'm out bird watching. And you know, even on quiet days, there's just something to see, whether it's just a great landscape, just a fabulous thing to see. The road deer, we have this family party of road deer now. There's 7 or 8 of them that just wander around. It's just absolutely fantastic. But you know, I'm an incredibly lucky person to live here. And I certainly made some luck for myself back in 1989 when we moved here. We moved here as a temporary fix, believe it or not, because we lived on Tyneside, Seaton Delaval. We wanted to move out of there. So let's find somewhere. So we found this place. We thought, great, we'll go and live there for a little while. We saw these birds early doors. We thought, this is pretty cool. But it was just to be a temporary fix. But 31 plus years later, we're still here. And it still thrills me. And it still entrances me. And it's still absolutely wonderful. So, thank you for listening, folks. And I'll